We're so glad to have everyone here today. I'm Robin Riddle with Stanford's Parkinson's Community Outreach Program and Brain Support Network. And I'm joined by my colleague both at Stanford and at Brain Support Network, Denise Dagon. She's helping us with questions and other technical things today. And we are so delighted to welcome veteran journalist Dave Iverson with us today. He's a longtime friend of our Palo Alto Parkinson's support group. He's presented a couple of times to our group members at our meetings when we used to be able to have them in person. And Dave is the producer of two Parkinson's related documentaries. Many of you probably have heard of them, or at least some of them. One of them, the oldest one is back in 2009. It's My Father, My Brother, and Me. And the more recent one, which is focused on dance, is called Capturing Grace, and that was from 2015. Many of you will, in the Parkinson's community, will recognize Dave as being the host for many years of the Michael J. Fox Foundation educational webinars on Parkinson's. And some of you in the local area will remember Dave from his work at KQED and the PBS. So Dave's memoir, titled Winter Stars, An Elderly Mother, An Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey, was just released last week. We're so glad to have him here. At the age of 59, Dave was diagnosed himself with Parkinson's back in 2004, and he was in the middle of making that first documentary I mentioned, when he decided to move in with his 95-year-old mother, Adelaide. And his memoir is about that 10-year caregiving journey. His talk today will focus on the choices and challenges of caregiving. And our format today is that Dave will be reading some excerpts from his book, and we'll have a chance to ask some questions as we go along. So please use the Q&A button or the chat button. For me, both of those buttons are at the bottom of my Zoom screen, and ask your questions, and both Denise and I will monitor the questions and what comes into the questions and into the chat. So take it away, Dave.
Okay. Thank you, Robin. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to speak with all of you. I'm really delighted to be here and have a chance to not only talk about my own experience as a caregiver, but also to hear from all of you as well. I think too often, as many of us as there are who are involved in caregiving, we don't often, I think, talk about it quite enough. And in some ways, I think the whole elder care crisis that this country is facing is a kind of quiet crisis. So I hope our conversation today will also help begin to spark a larger dialogue in this country about what we need to do to both support caregivers, those who are being cared for, and those who are professional caregivers as well. As Robin mentioned, I was in the middle of my broadcasting career, or somewhat late in my broadcasting career, I guess, at the age of 59, when I made the decision to move in with my mom when she could no longer really care for herself. And I'd like to start out by just reading an excerpt from the prologue to the book. And the prologue begins with a scene that actually took place about 6 years after I moved in with my mom, when her dementia was really beginning to be more apparent. And what was surprising in a sense was that, I was aware, others were aware of her dementia, but what I hadn't understood until this particular morning was that my mom, Adelaide, was aware of it too. So let me just begin by reading this excerpt from how the book begins. In the fall of 2013, I walked into the kitchen of my mom's house in Menlo Park, California. She was 101 years old, and the early stages of dementia were beginning to take hold. She looked up at me and said, "David, I think there are two Adelaides. There's the good Adelaide, the one who's pretty and smart and knows how to do things. And there's the bad Adelaide, the one who's ugly and stupid and can't do anything. I'm not sure which one is here right now, she said, but I think it's the bad Adelaide. My mom had always been a force. She graduated from high school at age 16, from college at 20, and at the top of her class in both. She'd been a teacher, a devoted spouse, a mother of three, a passionate sports fan, a loyal friend, and a powerhouse volunteer. When she was 94, she threw out the first pitch at a Stanford University baseball game. At 96, she made phone calls in her own very distinctive manner, urging people to vote for Barack Obama. And now the long arc of her remarkable life had turned in a new direction. Yet she'd been able to describe what was happening to her with searing precision and without tears. She was like that. She didn't blink, confronting most challenges with a firm, no-nonsense demeanor. No one ever trifled with Adelaide Iverson, and that included me. I'd moved in with my mom 6 years before. After my dad had died, she'd lived independently for 13 years, but at age 95, she'd had a difficult time with pneumonia and could not manage fully on her own anymore. I was a broadcaster and filmmaker living in nearby San Francisco. My life was full, but flexible. And it didn't take much deliberation to decide it just made sense for me to move in and help. But of course, there was a great deal I did not know. I didn't know I'd become so exhausted. I didn't know I'd be capable of getting so angry. I didn't know I'd be tested in ways I'd never imagined or rewarded in ways I'd never dreamed. I didn't know that someone with dementia can still be poetic, or that I'd get proficient at transferring my mom from bed to commode and back again, but never quite master the intimate skill of changing diapers. I didn't know I'd be joined and strengthened by remarkable women caregivers who became my teachers, my comrades, my kin, or that I discovered that the Parkinson's disease I had been diagnosed with a few years before would actually present fewer challenges than being a caregiver. And I never imagined that after I moved back in, my mom would live another full decade before passing away at the age of 105. The 10-year caregiving odyssey we shared affected me, humbled me, and reoriented me more than any other experience in my life. And during that decade together, my mom and I drew closer, I'd like to think, both to each other and to our truest selves. This is the story of our journey and of the remarkable women who accompanied us and changed our lives.
Thank you, Dave. The prologue is a wonderful introduction to a little bit about your mom and about some of the things you faced. Why did you make the choice to move in with your mother? That seems to have, you were the age 59 and she was 95. That doesn't seem to be a logical combination.
Yeah, it's a great question, Robin. And then there were certainly times in the years after when I asked myself that question too. The simple answer in a way is that I did because I could. And we're not always in that circumstance. I think it's really important to remember that not everyone is, either for reasons of distance or finances or flexibility or other demands on our lives. It's not something everyone can do, nor should everyone feel like it's something they must do. I could. I was single at the time. I had a very close relationship with the woman who is now my wife, but we lived separately at the time in our own apartments. I had a daughter who was grown and married, living on the East Coast. And my mom and I had always been very close. We understood each other in this really fundamental way. And I just thought I could do it. Now, of course, that was hopelessly naive. And there was a little bit of chutzpah in that too. I think it's both a strength and a weakness of mine that I thought I could, and so I did. And in some ways that's okay, because otherwise I might not have, and I wouldn't have been challenged in the same way, but I also wouldn't have been at some of the beautiful experiences that I also had. Also, people wonder, like, well, wait a minute, you were just diagnosed with Parkinson's, and by that time you knew your dad had lived with Parkinson's, died of the complications of Parkinson's. Your older brother had Parkinson's. What were you thinking? And my answer to that is that in a funny way, that played a role in it too, because I think, like maybe many of the people joining us today, if you have a condition that's limiting in some ways, you want to still do stuff. You want to do what you can. You want to feel like you're needed, I guess. And in a way, I wanted to do that. I felt good for doing that. I felt pretty good about myself, honestly, for doing that. And last, I would say it's because my mom was my first example of what being a caregiver means. She was a remarkable partner to my dad during his long road with Parkinson's. They were something else together. And she loved him to pieces and was devoted to him. But she was also no nonsense. And that was interesting to observe too. She, I think, somehow intuitively knew that just because you have Parkinson's doesn't mean you can't do things. It just means it takes longer to do things. So if there was a basketball game to go to at Stanford, well, let's get on our coats and go, which actually turns out to be a pretty great thing to understand. So I knew I couldn't be who my mom was to my dad exactly, but I thought I could try, and I'm glad I was naive enough to have made that choice.
One thing you make clear in the book is how ill-prepared you were to become a caregiver, and I think that's a common trait for all family caregivers. We have no idea how to buy Depends, them on, any of that kind of thing.
Right.
Can you say more about how ill-prepared you were?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I had closeness. So I had that going for me. My mom and I were close. But sure, I didn't know. I mean, I'll always remember bringing my mom home from the hospital from pneumonia after I decided that, she needed help, and I'd arranged for a caregiver to be there during the day. And very soon thereafter, I moved in too. And the caregiver greeted us. She was parked in our driveway when I brought my mom home, and I walked her around the house, and she said, "Well, I just have one question." And I said, "Sure, what's that?" And she said, "Where are the gloves?" And I had this like blank look on my face, like, gloves? It's September. What are you talking about, gloves? And then she smiled and said, for when I need to help your mom in the bathroom. Well, I would learn a lot about gloves and UTIs and all kinds of other things. So all of that was new to me. I also somehow, it never occurred to me that caregivers, like our very first caregiver, Tila, had a life of her own, So if her kids got sick, well, guess what? She had other things to contend with. I learned very quickly that, I could have my own to-do list, but if Tila was sick, then my to-do list was out the window. I learned that you're never really in control. I like being in control. I like being in charge. You are so not in charge when you're a caregiver. That was hard for me. So, I mean, it goes on and on. I wasn't used to being awakened 3 or 4 times at night to help my mom. I'd done that, 30 years earlier when I'd had a small child. But that's different. We all think and focus and are eager to become parents. I don't think many of us are eager or think about caring for a parent. So I had a ton to learn. Yeah.
You say in the book that quote, the question I probably asked the most during my time as a caregiver was, now what? Whenever I thought I'd figured things out, I hadn't. My solutions usually worked until they didn't. And I think that's for all caregivers. It's just steps back, steps to the right, steps to the left. It's just the challenging situation.
Yes. I mean, especially if you're someone who likes plans or likes figuring things out or likes to have, okay, here's how the day is going to go. And it just doesn't go that way, And so I think that was hard for me you still have to plan but you also have to accept that those plans you're going to have to adapt and change, that they're only good for that moment. And whatever well-conceived plan you had may almost certainly going to need to change. And if not the next day, the day after that. So yeah, I think that's really true. And I think accepting that, being okay with change, realizing that you're not driving this car, you may not even have a seatbelt on, is part of the experience. And I think to learn in time that you really can't do this alone, and we can talk more about this, but that's the great trouble that our country faces. I was lucky. I had resources, thanks to my mom in many ways, because she had a house that my folks had purchased in 1950 for a very small amount of money that by 2007 was worth a lot of money. And we could draw from the house, borrow against it to pay for care. But that's no plan. That's not a national plan. A national plan for caregiving isn't make sure your parents buy a house in Menlo Park in 1950. We have to do so much better than that so that we can get help. We don't have to do this on our own, both for ourselves, but for those who need care.
Yeah, so much of your book resonated with me as a former caregiver. And one thing you said was, we got by, which I would learn counts as an A rating in caregiving. It's so true. You just cannot be a perfectionist with caregiving. You just have to accept what is, and the fact that you made it through is the best you could do.
Yeah, I think that's right, Robin. I think you can aim to be your best. You just have to know you're not always going to be, and you won't always get there. I think it is important to try to be at your best, even though I failed that standard countless times. I think to want to strive to be with that person you love and give that person what you can and get the help that you can is really important. But yeah, to accept that you get all of it, and that every day, for me at least, it's like it all could happen on the same day. There'd be angry and frustrating moments, and then there's something beautiful would happen, or we'd go to the Stanford basketball game and cheer our brains out, but it could all happen. And then I'd have a sleepless night, and then it would start again. You get all of it.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, I think as part of the prologue, that caring for your mother gave you a new purpose. Could you talk about that and how whether you maintain that focus on the purpose throughout the 10-year journey, or did you lose that focus over time?
Probably all of the above. I mean, it did give me a sense of this is something that matters, and I'm going to do my best. And that was gratifying to me. I also had a choice. Not all caregivers do, especially those who are caring for a spouse. It just is almost assumed and a given that of course she'll do that. So, I had a lot of people saying, "Oh, what a swell thing I was doing." I don't think everyone gets that as a caregiver. So I benefited from that too. But it did give me an added sense of meaning. It also gave me a closer sense of family, not just with my mom, but we would sit around and talk about my dad and his Parkinson's, and my brothers and I would talk, and in a way, it sort of was kind of living out a part of our family story. And it honestly wasn't in conflict with the rest of what I was doing, I would discover either. You mentioned at the beginning that this started when I was just starting out making the film I made for the PBS Frontline series about Parkinson's. That oddly was sort of aligned in a way, because I was making this film about what was also kind of going on still in my own life, and the quest for figuring out a better way to contend with Parkinson's. Similarly, with a later film I did about dance and Parkinson's, which was this window into this extraordinary caring community who were all about taking care of each other. So for me, at least, and I was, again, extraordinarily fortunate, it was more reinforcing, I would say, than not.
Could you read another excerpt now from your book, Dave? I think you have an excerpt about coping with the exhaustion and the frustration and anger that is so common among, in your experience, and so common among all caregiving experiences.
Yeah, I think we all, so many on this call today, know that experience of being exhausted, of just being worn out, and being at kind of your wit's end. Some of that is just physical exhaustion. I mentioned earlier about being awakened at night, and just that sense you have of just exhaustion. That sense you have that another day is starting and you just don't know if you feel like you really want to do that anymore. And the anger that you can feel. I would get angry with my mom. I never had thought that would be possible, but I did. I mean, I hadn't been angry with her since I was a teenager, and here I was back in the bedroom I had been in when I was a teenager, and acting like an angry teenager again sometimes. And I'd get frustrated and feel like, oh my God, I'm telling you this for the 80 millionth time, all those feelings. Well, I'm just going to read a short excerpt from a time when I got angry. And it happened when we were going to dinner at my aunt's house. My mom had been forever the host for all family gatherings. But late in life, it wasn't something that she could do anymore. So this is probably when she was 98 or so. I'd been with her for 2-3 years. And we went to my aunt's house for dinner. It was part of a family gathering. And she was snappish and difficult and cranky. And I was, getting a little hot under the collar as well. So I'll just pick up from there. My mom wasn't happy, snapping at people and responding crossly when one of us tried to respond to her grievances. Over the next hour, I found myself getting more and more irritated. Finally, I stepped over to her and said, exactly as I would have to a 4-year-old, "If you can't act better, we're going home." A few minutes later, we headed for the dinner table. I didn't know you could stalk across the floor while using a walker, but my mom did. My aunt asked her where she'd like to sit at the table, and my mom snapped at her again. "That's it," I said, "we're going home." I steered her out of the room, out the doorway, and into the car. We drove home in silence. When we arrived back at the house, I ushered her into her bedroom with hands as comforting as steel. She stood next to her bed for a moment, gripping her walker, and then she just collapsed onto her bed. "I hate myself," she wailed. And here's the thing. I didn't say a word. I didn't feel anything other than a cold sense of satisfaction. I was acting like a self-righteous parent who'd appropriately reprimanded a bratty, but now repentant child. But as I look back, I don't think I fully took in what my mom was saying. I think when she said she hated herself, she meant exactly that. She hated who she was becoming, hated the sense that she was increasingly trapped in a world where she could no longer be who she had always been, including the person who had always hosted family occasions. My mom's wail was from the heart, but sometimes I felt like my own had turned cold.
Yeah, that's a profound experience for sure. But how the lack of sleep is just a big problem. It was a problem for you. It's a problem for most caregivers, especially those spouse caregivers who are on 24/7 with their family member. And as you were on 24/7 with your mother on the days that you stayed there, how did what caused you, or can you talk about how that lack of sleep caused you to realize you really needed help, that you couldn't do it alone?
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, I had it good from the get-go compared to many family caregivers, especially those who are spouses, because even from the beginning, I had someone there during the day. So in some ways, work was my respite. You know, I could do that. I could do something I loved, because I was there, you know, every night and all weekend. But I had that, you know, 40 hours a week or more when I was doing work. I also had, you know, the ability to get away on occasion at night. I would go up and see Lynn. She would come down and spend my wife Lynn would come down and spend a night one weekend out of the weekend each week. So I had more than many do, and over time I would learn that I needed to increase that. You know, one of my little truisms that I learned to believe when caregiving was that, you know, in time, all caregivers realize they need more help, and all caregivers realize that later than they should. And I think that's true for most of us. We keep telling ourselves, I can manage, I can do this, you know, I can get by. We all think we can get by. And again, I was more fortunate than many because I had the ability to get some assistance. But I think we have to give ourselves permission to get help if we can, to say it out loud even if we can't, to lean on others, and to be supported by others who love us. I was lucky in that regard as well. And again, that's why we so desperately need a better national plan in this country, because, you know, someone turns 65 every 8 seconds in this country, every 8 seconds. My generation, I'm 73 years old. My generation is going to be a nightmare, you know, for the next generation. We're going to be here, you know, too long. We have to get better about this. We just do. It is in all of our interests. You know, we live in such a divided time, but I have this wistful hope that this is the kind of issue that we all share. You know, it's not just Republicans who need caregivers or Democrats who need care or vice versa or all together. We are all in this. And we all need to remember that we are each other's keeper. And I believe that with all my heart. And I think we need to act that way and move this country in that direction, so that we're not all exhausted all the time.
One of the things, back to the story about your mother thumping with her walker through your aunt's home, was that you were surprised at at your capacity for anger at your mother, uh, did even after that instance, did your capacity, did you still exhibit moments of anger, and did they still surprise you, and what did you come to do about that, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'd like to say that was the last time that happened. It was not. There are other times I can remember. I can remember once sitting with my mom and making her cry. And my response was, go ahead and cry, you know, um, and then walking out of the room, slamming the door, standing in the garage and composing myself, and then walking back in and sitting down beside her and bursting into tears. And my mom then saying to me, don't cry, David, don't cry.
Oh, how sweet.
I mean, yeah. But sure, I lost it. Yeah, I definitely lost it sometimes. I think that's something you have to accept too. It's not that it's a good thing, but I do think we have to acknowledge it, acknowledge our responsibility for that, try our best to get ourselves in a place where that isn't going to happen, but accept our flaws. Caregiving reveals your strengths, but it also sure reveals your weaknesses and your shortcomings. I sometimes say that I think caregiving made me a marginally better person. And I think that's true, but it's only marginally. I don't know if any of us ever get all the way there, but it revealed starkly my weaknesses, and that's a good thing.
You're obviously a very vulnerable person, in the sense that in this book, Dave, you reveal these weaknesses about yourself, and you admit that this was less than perfect, but that you're human, and you're trying. And I think exposing these issues is a wonderful thing, because it helps us all feel that we're not alone and we're not the only ones experiencing this. Could
Exactly.
you talk a little bit? Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about other vulnerabilities? I know in the book you talked about your need to be right, and to be Mr. Right. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, this goes back a little bit to what we were saying about planning. I like to plan. I like to have a plan. I like to figure things out, but I also like to be right about my plans and explain why my plans are right. And so, that doesn't matter very much, especially if you are living with someone whose dementia is progressing. It's of so little value to correct that person or remind that person or chastise that person for being confused. I knew all that intellectually, of course, but I would still do it. I would still lose my temper sometimes. And so, yeah, that was a glaring weakness of mine. I wasn't always tuned in enough to how this was impacting Lynn, the woman who I was fortunate enough to marry. She was understanding to a fault, perhaps, and that's something to be aware of too. That how your caregiving relationship can affect other relationships in your life, and you need to be tuned in to that. And I was lucky in that regard yet again. And I was also, I think it also helped me, Robin, that I had these wonderful care partners, particularly two women, Eileen Khan and Sanai Latu, who were there, and who understood me and understood my mom and appreciated. We appreciated each other. They knew how much I valued them, but I also know they valued me and admired me for trying, even though I would fall on my face. And I learned so much from them. That helped a lot. That helped a lot. As did the support of others in my family and some very close friends. And my mom's friends who would continue to visit her. All of that allowed me to feel that I wasn't alone, as you can so often feel when you're a caregiver.
Yeah. I think that's a good segue, Dave, into the next excerpt that I'd like you to read in your book about the profession of caregiving and so many of the caregivers that you met along the way.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. Yeah, I mentioned before that in some ways, what I did for a living, being a broadcast journalist, hosting a radio show in San Francisco at the time and working on documentary films, was in some ways oddly often aligned with my life at home. And an example of that actually is on the question of immigration. I would often host shows on that topic. But being a caregiver and being joined by women who helped me, who were all immigrant women. And in my experience, that's just how it worked out. They were all immigrant women of color. And that changed my whole thinking about that. I mean, I think I was, progressive and open in all my thoughts about that, but it gave me a different understanding of that too. And so I'd like to read this passage that touches on that and on the kind of people I was joined with. Caregiving deepened my perspectives on stories I sometimes covered on the radio, like immigration. Until I became a caregiver, I hadn't had good friends who had to work 2 jobs or sleep on the floor in order to make ends meet. I hadn't seen the skill and compassion it takes to attend to someone else's most basic needs and to do so with tenderness and ease. And I hadn't really understood, at least not in such an intimate way, the additional challenges you sometimes face if your name is Tofa, Morales, Khan, or Latu, when your skin is brown and English is your second or third language. Their lives told a different story than the talk shows I sometimes moderated. Eileen and Sinai, along with Mele and Ronette, enhanced my life every bit as much as they did my mom's. It surprised me how enriching and important those relationships quickly became. And when unexpected kindness enters your life at a time when you need it most, it washes over your very being, releasing a wave of gratitude that can carry you through the great swirls of uncertainty that so often surround you. You begin to realize that you are not entirely alone. Not when someone offers the simple but extraordinary act of just being there when it's needed most.
It strikes me that that you learned a lot of things from these remarkable women. Were there altogether 5, Dave, women who were your mother's caregivers?
There were 5 what I would call principal caregivers. There were other people who helped at different times. And Eileen and Sinai were there for the majority of the time. Eileen for 8 years of that time, Sinai for 6, I guess. And so they were extraordinary, not only in their compassion, but in their skills which I hadn't understood or comprehended at all until I got to be with them.
What could you say? Could you give an example? What kinds
Sure.
of things you learned from them?
Well, one of the things I think we all know is that caregiving is a physical act, and it's an intimate act. It's all about touch and physicality, whether that's helping someone get dressed or helping them in the bathroom or wiping their brow, or spooning them food. It's odd, and especially I suppose if it's your parent, but it is intensely physical and intimate. I had to learn a lot about how to do some of those things, how you help someone put on an article of clothing, how to feed someone. As I say in the prologue, I never did quite master the art of diapering. But those are all things I sure didn't have a clue about. And they were so talented. And, my mom, I say in the book, my mom always had beautiful skin. Well, that just doesn't happen, especially not if someone's in bed most of the time, as my mom was the last few years of her life. And our hospice nurse, Chris Brady, who was a wonderful guy, just fabulous, but he would defer to Eileen on skincare often, because he knew that Sinai knew what to do and how to do it. We just don't appreciate those skills enough. That's one part of it. But I also learned from them that, I talked before about kind of falling short and not always being at my best. They were at their best. I would say like 95% of the time. Well, that's like batting .950 in baseball. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And they had that capacity, and they did it with such love. And I think it's because, in part, and I think I can say this safely with both Eileen and Sinai, because for them, they felt it was their calling. It was their purpose in life. It also was for them both a matter of faith and their understanding that that's what you do for your old, that caring for the old is part of life's bargain. And gosh, we could learn so much from that in this country. So yeah, I'm still close to them, talk to them both. We stay in touch. It's been one of the great gifts of my life.
One thing you make clear is that we as a society don't honor the work of these mostly women, many immigrant caregivers enough. Could you say more about that?
Yeah. Well, according to the Brookings Institution, in a study they did in 2019, the average wage for home healthcare workers was $12 an hour. Now, it's higher than that in the Bay Area, and I was able to do considerably better than that, again, because I had resources. But this is hard work, incredibly important work. And we don't pay enough attention to it. As Ajahn Poo says, who's the head of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, care is the work that all other work depends on, whether that's childcare or elder care. We could not work in this country if it weren't for people who provided care, be that childcare workers, our teachers, our elder care care providers. We need to wake up to that fact and do better by them. I was so disappointed when Congress didn't pass the Build Back Better Act. Don't need to get into politics, not saying that bill was perfect, but it would have provided a lot of support for people in elder care. Both those who need care, would have expanded Medicaid to provide people who need it most and options other than just institutionalized care, but more home care. And it would have helped those who provide that care. So I believe we have to all keep our shoulder to the wheel and realize this is not a red or blue state issue or a Democratic or Republican issue. It is an American, in the best sense, issue and challenge. The think sometimes about the Statue of Liberty that, where we, the beacon to welcome those who yearn to breathe free. But what I came to experience in my life with the caregivers was that it works the other way around. They provided me with safe harbor. They provided me with a welcoming embrace. And we're at our best in this country when we remember that. And when we remember that the fabric of our country needs all of us, needs all of those threads if we're going to be who we ought to be.
One other thing you've said in the prologue of the book is how striking it was for you to learn that your mother, although she had dementia, could still be a poet, could still be remarkably insightful and funny, and just a very interesting person, and interesting to be around, and interesting probably for the caregivers to be around. Could you talk a little bit more about, read another excerpt from the book about living with dementia and your mother?
Yeah. By way of setting this up, as I mentioned, I think earlier, one of the many things I struggled with my mom's dementia was the impulse to correct her, to say, oh, that's not true, and to correct her. And it took me a long time to instead try to place myself in her shoes a little bit and understand that what she was saying might not seem factually true, but it was truth to her often, whether that was a feeling like she'd been left alone for hours and hours when she hadn't been, but she felt that way. So rather than say, you weren't left alone for hours and hours, to say, well, I'm so sorry you feel that way. That must have felt horrible. And go from there, Took me an awfully long time to understand that. But she did, and I'd be very curious to know if others have experienced this, also had this remarkable way sometimes of saying things that were wonderfully poetic. She once was staring at a blank computer screen. I was trying to show her photographs of her great-grandchildren. The screen went dark, and she kept looking at it and kept looking at it and kept looking at it. And then she said, it's like looking into a dark river and not being able to see the fish. Well, where did that come from? Or once she said, I feel like the sun surrounded by clouds. The sun surrounds me. It's trying to poke through the gray. Well, to me, that's about as poetic a description of dementia and feeling like you're not altogether there, but you want to poke through as one could ever have. So I tried to learn to be better and to be in those moments rather than criticizing, and to just, as the actor and wonderful philanthropist Michael J. Fox once said, play the scene you're in. That as an actor, you know how the script ends and you know how the movie ends, but you can't act like that. You instead have to act and play the scene you're in. I think, and he said that's what applies to Parkinson's too. We know how the disease ends, but we can't live that way. We've got to live in this scene. And I think that's true as a caregiver too. So this is a story about a beautiful moment that my mom and I shared when she was 103. And I drove her to the ocean, which had long been her favorite, one of her most favorite destinations. So my mom had always loved the ocean. We'd taken the same drive as a family for 60 years over La Honda Road and heading towards Highway 1. When I was a kid, we'd always compete to see who could spot the ocean first. Today, as we approached the old San Gregorio General Store, the ocean came into view a mile or so away, but my mom's eyesight was such that she couldn't see it. And so I said, Mom, I have to keep my eyes on the road, so just let me know when you see the ocean. And it wasn't until we got about 100 feet from the water that she exclaimed, I see it. and a wide smile creased her face. We were at the point when I wanted us both to savor these moments precisely because I knew they would not last, that moments can't be banked or reclaimed later when you need a good moment credit. And so as we drove along the ocean on this beautiful spring day, I tried to remember to do better, to play the scene I was in, to take in the joy I saw on her face precisely because it would only be experienced then. For her, there wouldn't necessarily be a later savoring. I tried to remember that moments are to be treasured because they do not last. Like a cloud pushed by the wind, moments part as they become. As always, we pulled to a stop at Pescadero State Beach, our ocean destination for the past 60 years. Nobody in my family knows why this is true. Bean Hollow, a few miles further south, is prettier. Pomponio, a few miles to the north, offers longer walks along the cliffs. But Pescadero is home. We pulled into the parking lot just south of the beach because it offers the best view. We sat and watched, and we were quiet. As we parked there, I happened to notice that the children's book, The Little Engine That Could, was on the back seat. I'd recently purchased one to read to my 3-year-old granddaughter. I don't quite know why, but I asked my mom if she wanted me to read the book to her, and she said yes. Maybe it's because she liked the title. Maybe it's because, like the little engine that could, she was someone who always thought she could too, and was deeply annoyed when events transpired to keep her from that task. Her mission was to get up every morning and do what needed to be done for the good of the family and the good of society, and you do not stop. For my mom, getting old didn't include giving herself a pass. Accepting limitations was not within her DNA. It was her greatest strength, and now sometimes the source of her greatest sorrow. But in that moment, I read her a story. And together we took in the sound of the words, the wind, and the waves. Me. It's pretty out here today, isn't it? Adelaide. I like what's covering me. Me. Do you mean the blanket? Adelaide. I mean the sky.
Very, very touching. One remarkable thing about your mother that comes across in the book is that she had an incredible sense of denial. She's sort of, and I don't know if it was the dementia or something that she exhibited prior to the dementia, but she lived in her own kind of wonderful world.
Well, that definitely predates dementia. I came to believe and appreciate that a little bit of denial is really useful and really handy. By that, I mean that, she would, when my dad was starting to be in really rough shape, she wouldn't really focus on that. And she would tell me things that, again, I knew weren't probably factually accurate. Like, your dad and I had a great conversation today about the upcoming election. We watched the PBS NewsHour, and we were so interested in what's going on. And we really hope that this and this happens. And I knew that my dad at that point really was not capable of saying anything. But what I came to understand was that was actually true too, in a way. That in their own way, they did have that conversation. It may have been unspoken, but they were such a couple that I believe in a sense that they did. I think you need sometimes a little bit of denial, because if you just see the cold, harsh reality, I don't know how you always keep going. Now, that said, of course, you also need to be aware of your needs and make sure you get the help you need and support you need. So I don't mean to overstate this. But I think there is a little bit to that. And yeah, in her own and later in life, she still wanted to to keep going. I mean, shortly before she passed away, she was no longer able. When I got to the house, Eileen called me late at night, and I drove down to be with her because I wasn't there that night, and stayed with her until then. She died 3 days later, but she was no longer talking by the time I got there. And after a while, I asked my mom, I asked Eileen rather what her last words had been. And Eileen said, well, she said to me, I want to go. And Eileen thought that meant that Adelaide was ready to leave this life. And Eileen said to Adelaide, well, where do you want to go, Adelaide? And my mom's answer was, downtown. You know, so is that denial? Well, sure. But for me, that's pretty perfect that her last words were, I want to go downtown. You know, more power to you.
Because you and she enjoyed downtown a lot together.
Absolutely.
One thing I think you're very fortunate about your mother, Adelaide, is that she accepted support and assistance as if it was just a natural thing. Oh, why shouldn't I have someone come in and help me cook? Why shouldn't I use a walker from now on? I think you were extremely lucky about those kinds of things.
Totally. And it's such an interesting combination because she was fiercely independent. She drove until she was 90, and she was a good driver. She went to Stanford basketball games, even a few football games, until she was past, I think, until she was 102. So she was fiercely independent. But she also had a lot of pride and self-assurance. And she thought, well, yeah, people want to come in, and if people can be here and help me, okay. If I can use a walker to get around, I'll do that. You know, for her, it was all means to an end. I mean, what mattered to her was sustaining those things that she enjoyed. And if that required a supporting cast, she was good with that. Absolutely. I was remarkably lucky in having that, because I know that is often not the case.
We do talk about her stopping driving, because that's also very remarkable.
Yeah, she, as I said, she was a good driver, and I would purposely be in the passenger seat sometime to sort of monitor that before I moved down to live with her. She was a perfectly good driver. On her 90th birthday, she cut up her driver's license, literally just cut it up, and said, I want to stop while I'm ahead. I still feel like I'm a good driver, but you know, I want to make sure I stop while and she had a plan. Her plan was to budget $200 a month in taxi fare so that she could still go read to her friends out on the Stanford campus, that she could, you know, go to different places and visit people. I would come down on the weekends from San Francisco and take her shopping. She took the cab to the train station so she could come up to the city. So she had a plan, and that worked really well until she could no longer do that. And I arrived. But yeah, she was an interesting combination of independence and accepting dependence simultaneously.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. Well, if anybody has questions, please type them into the Q&A box or the chat box. And we do have a few questions. You mentioned, as well as we know, Dave, you have Parkinson's disease. You were diagnosed with it 15 plus years ago now. And how did your Parkinson's affect your caregiving, or did it?
Yeah, it's a very good and very fair question. As I think I said before, I mean, oddly, in some ways, it made me feel good about myself because I felt like I could. And I was extraordinarily, and continue to be extraordinarily fortunate. The standard Parkinson's medication, which are the same ones my dad took in 1971, work very well for me. I've been really disciplined. My wife would say obsessive about exercise. I think that's helped as well. I took up distance running actually when I was caring for my mom, both honestly as a way to sort of get out and be on my own for a while, but because I knew that was important. So again, I've been fortunate in really so many aspects of my life. One of them definitely being the slower progressing form of Parkinson's I happen to have. So I can't say that it was a big disadvantage. And I also have to obviously recognize that that's not necessarily the norm, and that many, many people with Parkinson's would not have this option. So I don't want this to seem like some heroic thing that I could do. It is not. It's just being really, really fortunate.
One of the questions is by my friend Dan, who has a neurological disease, and he asks, what can I do as a patient with a degenerative brain disease to make things a little better, easier for my dear wife who is a caregiver? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh my. Well, I would say, Dan, you're already doing it by just asking that question, just by saying that. That's just an incredibly kind and thoughtful, you're doing what we should do, who are the ones providing care. You're thinking of someone else and you're asking after her and you're showing her how much you love her, I would say. And, there's a wonderful quote I read recently by the author Gwendolyn Brooks. Let me see if I can get it right. I think it's like this: we are each other's harvest. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. I think all of that is true. And I think that you're offering that to your wife, and her hearing it from you means everything.
I think that's true. Another question's come in. Is there a particular moment you regret? You can only choose one, Dave.
Well, it would be the times I got angry, when I was more concerned with myself and not with her, when I was more focused on how hard this was rather than how hard it might have been for her. I regret that, but I also accept that. And I'm grateful that that was exposed, I guess. Yeah, but I have said sometimes that, I would I do it differently? Absolutely. I would be an idiot if I didn't do it differently. But that doesn't mean I regret the choice. And that doesn't mean I would want to try to do it again. If I could, I believe it is one of life's most intense and trying, but can be, if you're lucky, and if you're surrounded by a kind of what the author Marilyn Robinson says, the reservoir of good, that it can also be so beautiful.
And I think for us adult children caregivers who cared for parents, it can be very intimate in an extraordinarily surprising way. Of course, different in intimacy than spouses experience, but still very personal and very intimate. I think that's the best word.
Totally. You have this privileged opportunity to be there at this very tender time, that where life and death are beginning to approach each other. And that allows for just extraordinary times, I remember once my mom saying to me, and she did not talk about death and did not, and never said, I'm ready to die. But one day she said, I wonder what it will be like. And I said, well, do you mean dying? And she said, yes. And I hadn't really thought of what I'd say, but I sort of said, well, I think you'll be surrounded by love, and I think it'll be warm, and I think there might even be baseball. And I sort of went on in this vein. And then she finally said, oh, quit talking. So it was perfect. I mean, it was me being me, trying to, and my mom being, so, but yeah.
We have another question. These questions are remarkable. Thank you all so much for sharing them with us. They're just terrific, and please keep them coming. The question is, in dealing with your mother as a caregiver, did you ever confront your own mortality?
This is the second time I've been asked that question in the last week by in this kind of format. I was on KQED radio last Friday, and the host Alexis Madrigal asked me that question. So I better work on my answer. Yes, in that I began to appreciate that as we think about life's end, that it's, you could think you do all the right things. Oh yeah, I have a living will, I have an advanced care directive, but that's really not enough. There's a lot more that you have to do. And a lot of it is, I think, just having honest conversations with your family, with your spouse, if you have one, a partner, children, if you have them, close friends, and say something about what you hope to have happen towards the end of your life. And to describe what makes life meaningful to you. I've thought, and I haven't done this yet, and I need to write down and date it, a letter that says, what makes life meaningful to me is this. It might, being able to hike in the woods, being able to see the coast of Maine, spending time with my wife, Lynn, or my daughter, Laura, my grandchildren, being able to go to a Stanford basketball game, whatever it happens to be. And so long as I'm able to do that, well, then I would like to stay alive. But if those things can go away, then I'm ready to let go. And the reason why I think that's important is that's different than just checking a box on an advanced care directive that says, I don't want extraordinary means. Well, what are extraordinary means? Well, sure, you don't want to be intubated, maybe. That's easy. But there may come a point where you don't want antibiotics simply because you're in such a state anymore that all antibiotics are going to do is to maybe fix an infection, keep you living a few days more when maybe you can be kept comfortable without them. Anyway, I think it's a conversation we all need to have with ourselves and with those we love. Do I avoid thinking about it beyond that? Sure, I still do. So I need to think about that more too.
One thing I would add to your list of what gives life meaning is if you can appreciate the little engine. I think that's very important. A couple more questions have come in. How did you find your caregivers, the ones you hired for your mom?
Great question. When my mom was hospitalized when she was 95, and I was struggling with what to do next and realized that she'd need help at home, I talked to a very close friend who had gone through a similar situation with her mother, and she recommended a particular care providing agency. And so based on that, I called them. They sent some people over to the hospital while my mom was still in the hospital for my mom and I to interview. And we were both drawn to the same person right away. But I went different ways. I had people provided by agency. I also got lucky and found people. One was someone a friend of mine had recommended who had been a caregiver for her father. Another was when my mom was in an assisted living facility for a while following another hospitalization, a person there who cared for her. And I knew in a blink that she would be wonderful with my mom. Another was someone who cared for one of my mom's best friends, and that best friend died, and I called her and said, can you help? So, you know, it's not a time to be shy. I mean, you have to make phone calls, you have to try, you have to connect, and you have to trust your instincts about that. I came to believe that the way you know if someone's going to be good is if you feel relieved when that person arrives at the front door, you know, as opposed to feeling like worried and anxious. If you feel relieved, that tells you that you feel good about that person being there. Trust that, I would say. There are tons of questions you can ask, there are tons of referrals you can get, all well and good. But it's also really feeling that degree of comfort with whoever it is that's going to be helping.
I know at the end your mother was on hospice, and did you guys ever, or was it part of the conversation at that time to talk about palliative care prior to hospice addressing your mother's needs?
My mom actually had palliative care for several years before hospice at the recommendation of her internist. And we had a wonderful palliative care physician who came from the Palo Alto Medical Foundation, who came to the house and would check on my mom once a month or so. And so we made that determination when my mom was around 100, I guess, that, you know, we weren't going that it was all focused on comfort. But she had such an amazing iron will and iron constitution that she just kept chugging along. I mean, and she was on hospice for 2 years. She had to be recertified constantly because she just kept on. So that's why I think these larger conversations about how you want to handle these situations are so important.
You noted that the pandemic has laid bare the inadequacies of elder care. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was so fortunate, Robin. I mean, my caregiving experience went from 2007 until 2017. So predated the pandemic. The end of my mom died at the end of 2017. So, you know, 2.5 years before the arrival of the pandemic, or I guess 3.25 years. It's unbelievably harder, I think, now during these times. And I feel so for families, especially in the early days of the pandemic, who could not visit loved ones in assisted care facilities. But I think what the pandemic also laid bare was how ill-prepared we are. You know, about 200,000 people who have, of the people who have died in this country, 200,000 of them were people living in nursing homes. There are some fine, really good nursing care facilities. You know, both skilled nursing facilities as well as assisted living places, and good board and care facilities too. It's not that they're terrible, but we can't rely just on that. We have to be so much better prepared for that. And I think the pandemic, again, also laid bare the inequities in our society, you know, between who can afford good care and who can't, who gets vaccinated and who does not. We just, as with any crisis, it lays bare the divides in this country. And I think I wish it had been, and I don't think it fully has been, a real wake-up call to this country about elder care in particular.
Yeah. One kind of funny thing you say in the book, in our caregiver support groups, we at Stanford and we at Brain Support Network run caregiver support groups, and we think these are very important opportunities for caregivers to get together in a confidential setting and share their experiences and frustrations and challenges. And we're always telling caregivers, you have to put your own mask on before you can put the mask on of your family member with Parkinson's or whatever the disease is, Lewy body dementia. And and you, I'm sure you were told that many, many times. And you say in the book that this cliche is simply not true. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, yes. What I mean by that is, you know, we've all heard this. You can't take care of anyone else unless you take care of yourself first. All well and good and true. But we also all know as caregivers that that's just not true. In fact, you care for someone else all the time without taking care of yourself because you have to, right? It's just part of the deal. So I grew weary of that particular statement. That said, as I also, I think, said earlier, I think we're often too slow to realize sometimes when we do need help and care, and that we have to get that if we are going to have this be sustainable, because it is a long distance run. It really is. So, and find ways that provide support. For me, exercise was actually one of them. The support of friends was one of them. I had a very close friend from college, lives on the East Coast, who we would talk to often because she was also a care provider. We understood each other. You know, it's really helpful to talk to someone who gets it, you know, and who you don't have to explain the whole thing to. They're already on page 147. You don't have to start with the prologue. And I think we all need that. I just think we also have to, I think people who say that, you know, be sure to take care of yourself, need to realize that ain't easy to do. And sometimes people really can't because they don't have the resources to do it. It's hard to find backup caregiving. It's expensive to find backup caregiving. So we have to understand the whole picture that's involved in doing that, and not thinking it's just, oh, if you were only a little less selfish, you could go to a movie. Well, it isn't that simple.
One kind of nuts and bolts question I wanted to ask was, you made clear that you were so lucky that your parents did buy that home in Menlo Park back in the 50s, and that that afforded you an opportunity to provide your mother's care until she died. I know that you took out loans against the home, but then at the end, something unusual happened. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. We maxed out the home equity loan, and then I got it extended so we could get more. And then we were approaching the end of that money. And I was trying to figure out what we could do. One thought I had was, well, I could move my mom to an assisted care place and rent the house, and then that would provide money. You know, as a family, we had chipped in. I'd put money into the till to care, but I really felt like I can't keep doing that because there are other things I want to be able to save my own resources for. And then kind of out of the blue, we had this kind of angel appear. It was a close family friend for many, many years, knew my mom well. They were much younger than my mom, but were very close to her. And they were people of means. And they called and said, Dave, we know what's going on, and we know you're thinking about renting the house, but if you want to keep your mom at home, we'll provide you with a loan to be secured against the eventual sale of the house at a minimal, tiny interest rate, less than our home equity loan was. And it was really a gift because I didn't want my mom to be moved. I wanted her to be at home. I wanted her to have the best care. I knew that Lenin's and I, to a lesser extent towards the end, could provide that. But again, what does that say? That's all about privilege. That's all about, you know, as my best friend once said to me, Dave, what you're doing isn't unusual. It's just unusual for a white guy, you know, and that's the truth, you know, and I had white guy privilege that played into this as well. Yet another reason why we need a better plan.
One phrase that you used in the past at our Palo Alto Parkinson's support group meetings when you spoke there about having Parkinson's was the concept of addition, not subtraction. Could you say what that concept means to you, and can you apply it to your mother's journey and your caregiving role in that journey?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Robin. When I first was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and even before that, watching both my dad and my older brother, but more particularly when I was diagnosed and I began to be more aware of all that condition can include, I came to think of Parkinson's as a disease of subtraction, that it takes things from you, usually one by one. It might be an arm that doesn't swing, a hand that isn't steady, a step that isn't balanced, but it takes things from you. And I came to really believe that the only way you can really deal with a disease of subtraction is to believe in the power of addition and to keep adding things back into your life. My parents were wonderful examples of that. They kept doing stuff, going to basketball games, seeing friends, all of that. You have to keep adding to contend with subtraction. And obviously aging and caregiving both subtract. And so you have to keep adding. Again, in an interesting way, the Parkinson's community for me actually has been a great source of addition. I have very close friends who have Parkinson's. I was fortunate enough to be on the Michael J. Fox Foundation's patient council for many years. Some of my very closest friends are part of that group. I'm going to see them in a month for a patient council meeting that I'm going to go to, even though I'm not on the council anymore, because I want to see them. I want to see them. I think believing in addition, that's as simple as even a moment like this that we're all participating in together. There's addition in that. I feel that way. I hope you do as well. I think that's how we get through it. We get through it together.
Very well said, Dave. I had one other kind of nuts and bolts question, and then I'd like to ask you to close with a final excerpt. Your book is titled Winter Stars, An Elderly Mother, An Aging Son, and Life's Final Journey. And it was just released last week. And I know people can learn about how to buy it, where to buy it on your website, daveiversonauthor.com. And we'll post that information in the chat again. One of our attendees asked if the book is available yet on Audible. Have you been asked to do an Audible book?
Thank you for asking that question. I really want to make that happen. I have not made it happen yet. I've actually talked with an audio engineer pal of mine about doing that recording. So I will do it. I very much want to, both for selfish reasons and for community reasons. I know that not everyone who might want to read this book is able to read, and a lot of people prefer audiobooks. And for me, it is also a story, and it's a story I'd like to be able to tell in the spoken word. So I will make that happen. Don't know how soon, but I will make that happen. So thank you for asking that question.
That's great. In fact, the person who asked has Parkinson's disease herself, and turning the pages of a book is very challenging. So an Audible book is perfect. Right. And after all, you are a radio journalist. So you do have a beautiful voice that we'd love to hear you read your book. And speaking of that, if we could close the webinar then with the final excerpt from your book.
Thank you, Robin. I will. And if I could just mention one more thing that you will see on the website, but I'd like to mention, which is that the royalties from the book sales will all go to support organizations whose work supports elder care and those living with Parkinson's. So purchasing the book will benefit those organizations. Okay. This is about the last Christmas I spent with my mom. And my mom, as I said before, was always someone who wanted to go places and do things. And that continued into her very last year when she was confined to a hospital bed. She would kick at the bed because she wanted to get out and go places. I came to believe that she was really not ever going to be fully at peace. That just wasn't part of her MO, you know. But there was something different on this particular night. And so I'd like to read you a little bit of that story. I knew right away when I went into my mom's bedroom that on this December night, she was in a different place. There wasn't any restlessness. She just seemed quiet and calm. She looked to be, quite remarkably, at peace. We just sat there for a long time holding hands, and I felt a wave of tenderness come over me. After a while, my mom looked up at me and said in a voice that was soft and only slightly slurred, "You look wonderful." And I told her that she did too. And then I said, "We make a good pair." And she smiled and said, "What a pair." And then we just sat for a while, my hand on top of hers, just sitting together, nothing more. And then she turned her head to me and said, "I feel lucky." She said it with more clarity than anything I'd heard her say in recent months. And I told her that I felt lucky too, lucky for all that she had added to my life and to the lives of those around her, and that I would always remember what she taught me. And then she said it again, "I feel lucky." And so I asked her if she could tell me why. And there was a long pause. And then she looked at me with eyes as bright as winter stars and said, "Because there's love all around." On that Christmas night, I felt something I had not experienced before, that while my time with my mom was still unfinished, our journey was now complete. We'd endured our bursts of anger and frustration, but over time, our deep and abiding connection had always held. We had found a kind of steadying. And while the currents of time and age had taken us into a territory we'd never imagined, we'd kept traveling. And that journey had carried us to our truest destination as mother and son. It had brought me to the bedside of someone I loved so that I could hear the deepest of all truths, that there is love all around.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's a wonderful book, and we so appreciate your being with us today and answering our questions. And Michael J. Fox, for everyone, I'm sure you know who Michael J. Fox is. He's had some praise for Dave's book. It rings true for me. He says, "Winter Stars is a gift, a modern classic of frontier literature, documenting the uncertain journey into the country of caregiving. That Dave walked this path while himself living with a neurological illness is remarkable, but his story will resonate with everyone who has grappled up close with a parent or loved one's end of life." And I agree, the book is a gift. Thank you so much, Dave, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Robin, and Denise and everyone at Stanford. And thanks everyone for participating in this. It's really meaningful to me, and I deeply appreciate your interest. So thank you. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of this today.
Thank you. And again, for everyone, if you received an email from me at Stanford or me at Brain Support Network about this webinar today, you'll be receiving an email with the link to the webinar recording, and that'll probably be available no later than early next week. So thank you so much, and we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye. Thanks
Okay.
again, Dave.
Bye all.
Bye-bye.